All right. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully, you know we're in DataOps 101 here. So I know it's right before lunch, so hopefully sugar levels are still high enough from the coffee and the tea. All right, so let's just do a little housekeeping. Entertainment tonight, we got the quiz night at 7:30. I'll definitely be there, and don't forget, we got the party on Friday night. All right, a little about me. I'm John Kursky from the US. You can probably tell by my awesome accent. And I live in the DC area. I've been working in the Power BI space, or the Microsoft BI stack for 11 plus years. Going over to my credentials, I think the big thing to point out is my PMP. So a lot of what I'm going to talk today about DataOps comes from managing data analytics projects, working with Power BI, working in the Microsoft stack. I do have some, if anybody, as we look at the survey, has any other products that they use, I'd be happy to answer questions about applying DataOps principles to that. This is my contact information down at the bottom, and then the slides that I go over today are out there on GitHub. You can do the QR code. I'll leave that up during the question period as well. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background about DataOps, why it's important, and how can it help you. So hopefully after this, you'll be able to take the DataOps principles that you learned here today and apply them on your next project, and hopefully reduce a lot of the risks that we're encountering working in this field. So I think how many of you haven't taken the poll yet? All right. I'll give you 30 seconds. So this poll asks just 3 questions. It helps me understand just what products you're using, because what I'll do is I'll try to relate to those. I have a lot of Power BI anecdotes, but if I'm reading an Azure SQL room, definitely have some different ones. If it's using Python, we've got some other ones as well. So, okay, so I'm going to quickly change screens here. Let's take a look at their responses. Don't worry, they're anonymous. Unless you wrote your name in the comments area, so I can't help you. All right, so plus 5 years. Oh, is it not showing on the screen? I'm sorry. Let's exit here. All right, so we got plus 5 years in the field. Microsoft Excel, Power BI, SQL Server is the dominant ones. Okay, good. I got plenty of anecdotes on that one. Oh, wow. Okay, love to see a lot of Git users, so we'll talk about that a little more in depth. And then if we take a look at the question 4 and 5, we've got a lot of report builders, and all right, 4 folks using Power PBI tools and 20 folks using tabular editor. So that is awesome. I want to see that number for PBI tools go up. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. All right, so back to the presentation. All right, so to really understand what DataOps is, I want to walk you through a scenario of what we're trying to avoid. And so we're going to have walk through a conversation between Alex, the boss. He works for a very large corporation. It's got multiple data sources, Oracle, SQL, SharePoint, you name it. He's probably having to pull that data in. And they're trying to build an executive dashboard to give the executives the power to be able to make actionable decisions with good insights from the data that they have at their fingertips. Now, he's an impatient person. So Bob here is the data analyst. He's leading a very small team, maybe 4 or 5 folks, just learning Power BI, got a year, comes from a SQL experience. He says it's going to take a couple months to put it together. Alex is like, no, it's got to take 2 weeks. We got to deliver this faster. So Bob, works with his team, puts puts the Red Bull in his body, gets moving, and produces the executive dashboard in about 2 weeks. All right? It is now deployment day, day one. The executives are happy with what they've seen so far. And so what we're going to walk through is a conversation on my favorite chat tool, Microsoft Teams, on what that's like. So let's hope. All right, so day one. Alex sends, great job. All right, their executives are happy with it. And he gets a Picard. So feeling that millennial feel, Bob should be pretty happy with himself right now. That's great to hear. So day one's looking pretty good. All right. Day two, Bob opens up his laptop, takes a look at his phone. He sees that lovely important message. If you don't know where that is on Teams, I'd suggest looking for it. It gets your attention. The executives are in a meeting, Alex says, and the slicer doesn't have all the options like it did yesterday. Can you fix it? All right, so Bob's like, I could take a look at it. He's on it. Responds back, all right, I'm going to be the hero here. Come in, swoop the day, make Alex look good by addressing the issue quickly. Thanks for saving the day, superhero. I want you to keep in mind that word superhero here. All right, day three. All right, this is when the accountants or the Excel analysts come in. Charlie in accounting looked at the new Power BI report, Alex says, and he says the numbers in the table don't add up correctly when you update the slicer you fixed yesterday. All right, so Bob just made a change to the Power BI file. We got a regression error that came in. All right, so Bob's like, all right, I need to slow down here, make sure when I'm making these changes, I'm not introducing regression errors, I'm not introducing new issues. He says, that's going to take 2 days just to make sure. I need to slow down to make sure we're doing the work right. Alex doesn't like that. He's like, hey, I got meetings. We got to get this fixed today. TikTok. So now we graduated from Star Trek, and now we're working on an Alfred Hitchcock movie here. All right, so day 4. Get a call from the executive. The KPI card that uses the same measure in the table you fixed yesterday looks wrong. All right, now the numbers aren't looking good. That's troublesome. Bob says he's on it with his team, sends him a Ron Burgundy, says, I'm sorry about that. All right, so we're 4 days into this. It's not looking that great. Alex is like, I don't need more errors. I'm sitting in these meetings. We just had our release. Executives, accountants are all saying that the numbers aren't working well. Maybe the dashboard's not behaving correctly. It's not looking that great. Day 5 rolls around. Bob's probably pretty tired, and his team's pretty tired at this point. Accounting called again. The model has a new column in it. Did you do that? All right. Bob's like, no, let me check. If any of you have ever worked with a SharePoint data source, you probably know how those columns show up. All right, it's a rough week, Alex says. That's probably an understatement for Bob. And now, when I started the week feeling like he was top of the world He-Man, he's now falling flat on his face, not looking that great. And this is obviously a compressed schedule in terms of experiences I've had on projects. This can happen over the course of 2 weeks, a month, but in the end, you have folks who've lost confidence in the data that they're seeing. They've lost interest. They don't like the slow delivery, making Alex look bad, and ultimately, they either abandon the dashboard or they're going to look to another team to build that dashboard for you. How many of you have had a similar experience with deploying reports or dashboards or any analytics tools? Hands up? Okay, all right. So this is not unique to what I'm telling you, obviously, and that's because from a project perspective, we have risks in this industry that lead to issues. So a risk is something that could happen. An issue is something that has happened. And so what are our risks that if we're working with Power BI, SQL, or any analytics projects that we're at risk at? Well, the first is pretty much every data strategy you read out there right now. I think that's the first at least 4 words. Data is a strategic asset. I work in the federal government in the US. Pretty much every CIO is putting that on their first part of their strategy. The risk for us is demand is high. There's always a need. You put out a dashboard, I want a new dashboard. You have a report, I want a new report. Can it do this? Can it do that? The features are always coming in. I want more data. That demand's high. How do you maintain a level of output when that demand's high? We also deal with complex data lineage. Often in our industry, especially if you work for large enterprises, you might not know actually where that data source comes from. It might be 4 or 5 hops through. You might have to call some SQL DBAs to go fix an issue that you got called about, and they don't work for you. They work for other bosses. They have other priorities. And so we have to deal with complex data lineage issues that ultimately also introduce another risk, and that's data quality issues. We have these columns that all of a sudden, maybe 90% of it was full when it came in last night. Now we're down to like 50% of the columns, or the column values are empty. What happened? This is supposed to be an email address column, and it's got phone numbers or a dissertation somebody decided to write in there because somebody let free text happen. Seen that? It's not fun. We have these data quality issues as well. So these are the risks that we face, and then they introduce these errors, or these issues, the defects and errors that we have. When you have defects and errors, what does that lead to? Just like what Bob was experiencing, he needed to slow down. When you have defects and errors, you have to test more manually, at least especially in the Power BI realm. That leads to slower delivery. That's slower delivery also increases time. It also, maybe many of you have asked, hey, I need another person to help me out to do this work. That means I got to add staff to my project to work on these issues. That's problematic because that leads to more cost. And when you have more cost, slower delivery with full of defects and errors, ultimately the other issue that bears is the disappointment. The disappointment in your customers, your client base, and they either, again, are going to move on from using your services, or they're going to look to another team to do that. And behind this, another issue I didn't identify here is we all ultimately lead to a version of burnout if you have to address these issues constantly on the project team. So this is very common in the industry that we work with, and I came to this topic, DataOps, because I had a good 4 or 5 month long project in which I got very little sleep, drank way too much caffeine. I really got into chocolate to soothe me, and ultimately you end up just babysitting reports on dealing with issues, and it was quite stressful because this project was putting data out there for executives to make decisions that would impact the lives of people 10 to 15 years from now. So very, very stressful when you think about what data you're having to deal with and the type of reports you're building. And so I looked to say somebody else has to be dealing with this in the industry. And somebody was, a gentleman named Chris Berg, who actually works for a company now called Data Kitchen. He came up with the DataOps manifesto along with his colleague. And this was supposed to introduce a set of principles and a framework for you to apply on any data analytics project, so that when you're coming into the project, you can think about these things ahead of time, so that when you have these risks, you can avoid them or mitigate them becoming an issue. And so what Chris came up with was not necessarily, I would say, a brand new bottom up, but it's taking the great concepts from pro code and industry. And so he took 3 areas. He took DevOps. He took the concepts of continuous integration and continuous deployment, and said, hey, we need to do that with data analytics. We need to make it so that when I make an update, I can have it tested and we can have it deployed and have it almost immediately at the fingertip of our clients. At the same time, a lot of analytic projects weren't adopting Agile. How many of you actually have Agile in your... Okay, so that's good. That's good. How many of you think that the Agile process could be better in your organization? Okay, so you're adopting Agile, maybe sometimes in name only, maybe Scrum Waterfall, those kind of things. He really pushes in the DataOps principles on continually satisfying your customers, looking at building in sprints so that you can start pushing out incremental changes to your products to continually satisfy your customers, and embracing change. And then the third, which I think is a differentiator from other ops that you see out there, is the adoption of lean manufacturing. The big piece here when you're looking at lean manufacturing is, as a data analytics project, we need to treat every hop in the data chain as a manufacturing line. Now, in a manufacturing industry, when you are assembling a product, there is always quality and monitoring involved. So whether you're putting a door, you're testing that door, you're monitoring that door, you're monitoring the size, making sure everything's good, so that you're proactively addressing any issues before the customer sees it. You don't want to have that issue on the road when you're driving your car. You want to be able to address it before it's off the assembly line. They packaged that all up in the DataOps manifesto. And so that's a set of 18 principles that if you apply those, I wouldn't say you have to apply them all today, but as you gradually introduce those into your project, you can think about planning your projects better, introducing those into your teams, getting the training in place so that your team's prepared to address not just day one of delivering the dashboard or the report like Bob did, but thinking about the long-term supporting that and being able to address those issues. So with that, what that does is you can think of DataOps and DataOps principles as a shield that mitigates, never eliminates, it mitigates the issues that you're facing with demand is high, the complex data lineage, and the data quality issues. All right, so at this point, you're probably like, all right, great marketing speech, John. This looks really, how does this actually practically help me walk out of here in the next 30 minutes with some to-dos? Well, I'm here to say I have 5 of these principles that I want to run through the day in my own kind of experience on what you can do to take those principles and apply them to your project gradually. So I put them in sequential order. So you think about this first principle, you want to get in the next couple weeks. The next principle, you want to look over the next couple months. So I'll repeat that, but think about introducing these gradually. It's a evolution in your program management or your project management experience. It's not a revolution. You're never going to, from a change management perspective, have all these principles applied perfectly in just under a month. All right, so the first principle, make it reproducible. And I've highlighted the versioning here. Versioning is hugely important in our industry. So and I know many of you said that you know Git, but teaching business analysts and teaching analysts, if you can, how to use Git is hugely important. There's some great tools out there like GitHub Desktop that you can kind of learn how to use Git. Visual Studio Code makes it fairly simple to use Git these days. I've seen a lot of folks come out of at least where I'm from university, from college, and they have a data science background or a data analytics business analyst background. They don't know Git. They didn't use source control. It's something that's very important in order to walk back changes, look at differences. Git's very important. And so just to reiterate, You want to get version control into your work very quickly. Now, for those of you who are probably saying, okay, I'm not going to teach Git to a bunch of people who came from the Excel world, at least think about getting the either Power BI reports or the content that you're using for your reports into like SharePoint, OneDrive, leverage version history. Power BI has a wonderful tool where you can sync your OneDrive with Power BI. At least without Git, you can't really do some of the diffs, but the version control, by default, I think it's like 500 versions. So you can at least roll back, look at the month changes, and if you have to go and find that. And given that, if you walk away with anything today, please don't have your version control look like this. I made this up, but I've seen this on several things. How many of you actually, somebody asks you to go make an update, you go to the report, you go to File, you go to Download, and it's sitting in your Downloads folder? Raise a hand. Okay, I saw one back there shyly raise their hand. All right, well, I did. A lot of team members do. This is not version control for your executive dashboard. Get it into SharePoint if you don't have pro coders or you need to have business analysts work on it. Otherwise, look at using Git. Now, I'll have some references at the end here, but if you're into Git, PBI Tools is a wonderful tool for understanding how changes work. You can do comparisons. I would highly suggest, I think tomorrow, Matthias Durbach, the author of PBI Tools, is actually doing a demo of kind of the new version of PBI Tools and what's coming down the pike. Highly suggest doing that. I don't have enough time to go through what PBI Tools can do, but if you're using Git today, you haven't used PBI Tools, highly suggest that. If you're doing just straight data modeling development and not necessarily the front-end visualizations, obviously Tabular Editor is a wonderful way of doing version control as well. All right, so first couple weeks, you're on a data analytics project, get it into version control. The second thing is looking at applying the principle of quality is paramount. This means you want to detect any abnormalities in your data. And what does that mean? That means when you find an error, you're going to build a test. Somebody says this KPI doesn't work correctly. Somebody says that calculation's wrong. You should always, when you're going to make the fix, build a test, because the number one goal is you never want to see that same issue in production again. You never want to see that same issue in production again. And with that, you want to make sure that when you build these tests, this is your safety net. How many of you have gone into a project and you kind of inherited a data model or a report? Raise a hand. All right. How many of you were kind of like, you make a change and you go to publish and you're doing this, or just praying that nobody gives you a call that you broke something? Well, yeah, exactly. So think about your project team. If you, as a experienced project manager, data analytics lead, want to move on to the next cool thing or work on another project, these safety nets are a way that you don't have to babysit these the older data models or fix the issues that you fixed in the past. It's really looking out for your project team coming into it, that what tests can do as a safety net. Now, running tests can be fairly difficult if you're working in Power BI. I have some links to some content where you can learn how to do testing using Dex Studio, integrating it with a project called Gherkin. So Pester is a testing tool with PowerShell. You can leverage Pester to actually run PowerShell code that tests your Power BI report. I have a link to a template and some instructions on how to do that. Does any of you follow Data Goblins? They have a wonderful checklist on how to do testing with Tabular Editor. I would suggest if you're into Tabular Editor, go to Kurt's website, take a look at that. Testing's tough, but testing's always not the most glamorous type of work. But when you think about the errors you see, you don't want to see that in production again, and test the safety nets for the future of your team and the future of the project. This is why quality is paramount, is you need to think about that now. Because what you don't want to do, especially if you're 2 or 3 years after the project, is introducing those tests kind of retroactively. Sometimes that introduces technical debt, depending on who you're working with. Technical debt's not always the most savvy thing that you want to try to convince folks on it. What I usually suggest, if you are inheriting a project and you need to put testing in, when you see those errors or you see somebody having to manually check stuff, try to figure out how you can build a test for it to reduce that workload. You don't want to try to do every test on everything that you have. Just slowly introduce it when you find errors. All right, so you got your version control, you're looking at testing. The third is, now this is usually about 3, 4, 5 months into the project, depending on your project team, is orchestration. You want to build the end-to-end orchestration. So when you go to publish, it should be as simple as checking in the code, do the test pass, it published the Power BI report, then you can leverage something like deployment pipelines to move stuff through the process. You don't want to be the one having to manually push the buttons to produce this reports. And what I mean by that is you want to have continuous integration. How many of you use an Azure DevOps? Raise a hand. Okay, so I mean, if you haven't used Azure DevOps before, up to 5 people, it's free to try out. Wonderful tool to get started. There's some great connectors built in to Azure DevOps that allows you to do what I call low-code continuous integration and deployment. You want to make sure you have continuous deployment, like I said, and you want to emphasize scripts over clicks. Anytime you're having to do a repeated process, either you're doing it in Azure or you're doing it in app.portal.com or whatever version of Power BI you're using, if you're having to do that as part of your deployment process, you need to look at scripting it. Now, Power BI is a wonderful PowerShell commandlet that you can do a lot of this work with. Like I said, with Azure DevOps, some of that stuff's already automated. You can use that as a step in your deployment pipeline to move stuff between sections and deployments, for publishing reports, for refreshing reports. Even Power Automate, if you're running like an E3 licensing, can do some of that automation for you. Now, it's important to point out, if you come from the pro-code world, when we're looking at orchestration, we actually, in our industry, in analytics, we actually have 2 versions of orchestration. If you're working on like a project that doesn't involve data analytics, maybe a website application, you're typically doing, you do the development with your database, maybe you got a JavaScript application, you're doing the testing, integration, deployment. Well, for us, we do it twice. The first is what I would consider your continuous integration on the data, building the value chain, getting the data in a portion or a location that you can actually hand it off to another team or switch gears and start doing the next thing, which is the analytics and the visualizations. So from a Power BI perspective, you consider the orchestration of the data is your Power Query work, getting it into the model, getting it into the data set. The orchestration on the analytics side involves making sure that are the DAX measures calculating correctly? Are my visuals accessible? Do they have an alt text in it? Are their contrast colors looking good? When I hit that slicer, is the interactions between the other visuals working appropriately? Is that bookmark actually behaving the way that it should? That's the difference in a lot of the work that we do compared to other DevOps projects. DataOps focuses on orchestration of the data and orchestration of the actual visualization, the analytics. All right. So now that you've got your version control, you're doing your testing, you're putting in place automation, now you're looking at monitoring quality and performance. This is, from a Power BI perspective, this is kind of key. How many of you have kind of like alert fatigue with emails? Yes. How many of you have had a failed refresh that goes in that mysterious unfocused box in your Outlook thing and you kind of miss it? There you go. So monitoring is hugely important, and you need to think that setting the email address in a Power BI refresh or a Power Automate is not necessarily going to be sustainable in the long term. You need to look at centralizing or figuring out a way to monitor those reports because what you want to do is you want to catch the errors before your customers do. A failed refresh, latent data, you don't want to get that phone call. You want to be able to call them. I'd say the most impactful experiences I've had with customers that brought them back to me on other projects is when I called them and said, "Sir, ma'am, I had an issue. We are aware of it. We're fixing it. And if I knew when we could get it fixed, I could tell them, or tell them, hey, in about 30 minutes, I'm going to call you with an update." They appreciated that. Then they felt like somebody is actually looking out for them, and the product that you're working on is being cared for and looked after. That is a huge change in the mindset of the client if you're addressing that. And that's why monitoring is so important. So that monitoring from a Power BI perspective can be monitoring the data set refreshes, the refresh times. Did the schedule for the refresh get disabled? How many of you have had a lovely weekend or a SQL maintenance backup or maintenance happen? You have a refresh fail 3 times, and Monday morning you're wondering why the data's not refreshed. There you go. Happens all the time. I work for very large organizations where I'm not necessarily the Power BI admin and not necessarily the person who's in charge of the upstream. Monday morning, I know there's a maintenance window for something, and 3 or 4 of the Power BI data sets may have disabled the schedule. And then I got to go in and fix those. But if you know that in advance, your customers don't know that change, and that's how you can address those. So the other piece with monitoring quality and performance is practice what you build. I would say probably many of us are building dashboards and reports that are putting metrics together that's judging or monitoring or evaluating how well the company is or the organization is operating. Why aren't you holding yourself to the same standard? And that's why monitoring quality and performance is very key to your operations. One other bit about that too. If you're ever in an organization where maybe you're competing with another data analytics team, having this kind of monitoring report is a differentiator, that you're actually monitoring and applying the same type of principles for metrics as the rest of your organization. All right, so the 5th principle. And I used to just keep 4, but I think the 5th one is really important, especially after us going through COVID, has been reducing heroism. If you remember back when Alex sent that message to Bob, and he's like, "I'm on it." He's got the He-Man thing coming in the superhero. Superheroes don't get vacations. And what's worse is if you're constantly having to have someone on your team swoop in and fix issues, that means they're not building new products, they're not spending time learning new things, and eventually they probably didn't come into that job wanting to babysit a report. They came in to try to innovate, teach people new things, and make new products and learn new things and collaborate with folks. If they're always heads down fixing issues, chances are either they're going to look for another job. And so when we think about reducing heroism, the big piece takeaway is avoiding burnout. If you're in a meeting or you're in a call and there was an error and somebody said, "Well, I fixed it. I came in, fixed it," and you get a big thank you on that, that's good. Where can you automate that check? Where can you standardize that process so that person, if they got sick, they went on leave, you can still continue to operate? What you want to do is create that basis so that you don't have heroes on your team. You have engineers who can think about when they're not around, they want to take a vacation, operations can still continue. I could say we have project teams. I got several projects out there. I can kind of do these talks because I know that we have operations in place where people are monitoring, and we have a schedule to keep an eye on these data sets that we have in production. I can breathe easier, and I'm not racing to my laptop after this meeting to make sure that everything's okay. It's because the process. I don't need to be the hero trying to work on these projects. We set that up. All right, so those are the 5 principles. What's very important about principles is whether you're working with Power BI, Azure Synapse, there's a merger tomorrow, and all of a sudden you have to work with, God forbid, Tableau and Click. That's for the Microsoft folks. You can apply these principles. When the new product comes out, you think about 7, 8 years ago, Power BI is just making onto the scene. What's going to happen next year? Maybe there's a new product that Microsoft comes out with, and you now have to inherit and start building a data analytics tool on it, or a new feature in Power BI comes out. If you're applying these principles, you can think about how to make your project successful no matter what tool you're having to use it with. All right, so if you didn't like me talking about the principle aspect of it, I've got some aphorisms that are built into the DataOps manifesto to kind of walk away with. So aphorisms, first one, it's not about the fear of making a change, it's about the removal of fear from making changes. You shouldn't have to hit that publish button, cover your eyes, or hope that you're not going to get that phone call. That's where continuous integration, testing, and deployment come in. It's not about the data quality, it's about the low rates of errors, trying to catch those issues before they go to production. It's okay to have, if you're not responsible for that upstream, to have data quality issues. You know that people are probably entering data incorrectly. You can't necessarily influence how that changes. But if you have a data quality dashboard or a monitoring tool that highlights those issues to your customers, then it's on the upstream to deal with it, but you've been proactively addressing it. It's not about the next analysis, it's about building a system that makes it easier for the next analysis. You're going to publish that report, you're probably going to get another question, hey, when can I have the next dashboard? When can I have the new page in that Power BI report to build? You need to think about that version control, the testing, so that you can move on to the next project, have a template, you know that the pipeline's in place, you're deploying your Power BI reports to production, and you can just add the next one in, and you're not having to start from the ground up, building a whole new manual testing process. You have to think about the system that you're building as opposed to each iterative product. You spend all day helping your customers be more analytic. So why are you so unanalytic about how you run your data analytics teams? So this goes back to practice what you build. If you're building metrics for other customers, why aren't you holding yourself to the same standard in terms of the number of refreshes that are failing, how long it's taking those refreshes to happen? Are your data flow schedules being unscheduled? Are your any of the Power Automate flows that you're helping produce reports to your customers, are those operating correctly? How often are they failing? How much testing do you have? Don't solve problems, figure out how never to create them in the first place. Again, if you see that error, you never want to see that error in production again. All right, so I'm going to go over the resources and I'll open up to questions. I know we got about 10 more minutes. Resources, DataOps Cookbook. If you didn't like hearing me talk for about 50 minutes about DataOps, you should go read the DataOps Cookbook. It is a wonderful, very lengthy, but it goes over Chris's own experience with DataOps and why he came up with the concept. He also has a podcast version of it that he's done on YouTube. Highly recommend watching that. From a version control standpoint, when we're talking about making it reproducible, there's a GitHub desktop tutorial if you've never worked with GitHub or Git before. Wonderful tool to get acquainted with Git. And I can't stress enough, if you're working in kind of a pro code environment, PBI tools, especially if you're having to maintain changes in visuals and kind of understanding what's changed in those visuals. PBI tools is a wonderful tool to help kind of, probably the best out there today to understand those changes. And if I have some time, I can show you what that looks like. Testing and orchestration. There's a video I've done on YouTube. Watch how I build a DataOps pipeline. It's free, open source, MIT licensed. You can download it, start working with it today. Visual testing. This is something on a couple of projects I've been recently doing, if you need to automate the testing of your visuals, like is all the visuals have an alt text if they're non-decorative? Do they have titles? Are they using the right theme file? Are they using the filter pane correctly? Are all the visual level filters disabled, or they've been hidden from the user so that they're just using the report filter or the page filter? Those are the kind of checks we're trying to automate now, so you can try to avoid having to have somebody go in and check that. Because in the past, what you've had to do is either have somebody on staff run through that check, which is prone to error, or you have to use another tool like Selenium or a screen recorder to try to walk through that process. This just goes straight into the JSON files that lovely PBI Tools helps you extract to inspect your visual contents and do your testing there. And finally, the monitoring. I have a template out there for monitoring data sets. We'll be producing another template here in the next month or so on monitoring data flows in Power Automate. But you can download that today along with a open source connector, and you can start monitoring your workspaces for common issues like failed data set refreshes, your data set schedules have been disabled, long-running data sets, and then you can get at least the last 30 refreshes, what the statistics are on the refresh time, medium, standard deviation, and whatnot. And with that, I'll open up to any questions. The artist screen on here is my daughter. She was very happy for me to go to Wales, so she wanted to draw me a picture of a Welsh dragon. So, all right. Let's see what time we got.
9 minutes.
All right, so that's good. Yes? Yeah, the question is, how do you convince Alex that this is the approach? Yeah, so the part where you convince Alex is you show him what monitoring can do to avoid and make the customers happy. The other thing you do is, Alex, we're going to start breaking up this work so that in 3 weeks, you're going to get this. And then 3 weeks, you'll get this. And we're going to keep pushing stuff out. So it gives us time to do testing, and you're seeing progress. I've seen that work well with some customers. It is an iterative. I would say as a project manager, I would spend a good month just hand-holding an Alex and talking with them how this process is going to help them. And then you keep reinforcing that. It's definitely a communications plan. If you're working as a project manager, your lead stakeholder, you need to be in constant communication with them, convincing them about this change. So I would dedicate time as a project manager to focus on that. Well, yeah, that's a good point. So the point is, so you're babysitting the customer. Well, if you're managing a project correctly, and from an agile perspective, you should always be in constant communication with the product owner and the client. So I wouldn't necessarily consider it babysitting. It is how you keep that line of communication in place so that you know what this next feature you got to put together. What's the next thing? Eventually, it smooths out. They get used to the routine, and within about a year, they kind of see the progress, especially if you're successful. Yes, next question.
On the first principle, you said make it reproducible, and you talked about the code.
Yeah.
But what about the data?
Yeah, so.
We often do not control. It comes from somewhere else.
So great point on the data. How do you make the data reproducible? So the big piece about making the data reproducible, what we do on our projects is we'll take snapshots, if possible, of the data or time-bound it, so that when you're testing your code, you're testing a static data set. Or, so from that perspective, the only thing that's changing is your DAX measures or your Power Query code or your visuals. That's the piece you're testing. The data hasn't changed. snapshotting data. That's easier said than done if you're just working with Power BI. What we tend to do on some of our larger projects, like the one that got me stressed out and looking into DataOps, we'd actually take snapshots, it was in a SQL data warehouse at the time. Now it's a set of Azure SQL. But we would take snapshots because we wanted to make sure that the decisions that were made had a snapshot of that data that could hook up to a Power BI report. You have to kind of plan architecturally to have some snapshots on that, especially if you know there's going to be some major decisions made on that data. If you're using Premium, Azure Analysis Backup is really helpful because then you can also back up your Power BI data sets to Azure Storage. We've used that before as well. Hopefully that answers your question. Other questions?
So,
Yeah.
this seems quite targeted at pro teams, I guess. How do you try to take this approach and adopt it to citizen development and potentially that's fair rated team?
Yeah, so the question is how do you move from a pro code to maybe the business or citizen developer perspective? I would suggest from make it reproducible, SharePoint, integration, OneDrive sync. That is a huge game changer. Deployment pipelines, if you're running Premium, at least you can separate dev, test, and prod. I've had a couple of people who came from the Excel world. They're working with Power BI. At least I know that they can use deployment pipelines, hit the push button and sync from dev to test to prod. And at least at that point, you have the ability to have somebody testing and you're not affecting production when they make a change to Power Query or the code. The other kind of aspect is you slowly need to maybe integrate some sort of automation engineer to help them out. Supplement, maybe automate some of those checks for them. Otherwise, they're going to get bogged down with some of those manual checks in the reports that they have to do. It's not foolproof these days, but that's the best steps I've seen. So the other aspect is if you get somebody in automation, you can show them how to write deployment releases in Azure DevOps using a low code. Just click the button, set up the pipeline so you can do a release to a branch. That's also something that's worked well on a prior project that I had with folks who weren't necessarily pro coders. All right, 3 more minutes? Okay, well then, let me pull up. All right, so let's say we have, from a version control perspective, we got a data model here. How many of you have had to say, okay, I'm looking at this data model, I've got one in desktop, all right, what's changed? That's tough. Some of it is very easy where you can see the changes are there. But how do you know what's happened under the hood in Power Query? Well, with PBI tools, what it will do is if you're using, and I have this template out there, it will actually extract the contents. It enters in something called watch mode, so you can actually run this locally. If you have it hooked up to version control, I can actually see file by file what's changed. And so I can actually see that in Power Query, this iColor dimension that I was working with, I changed the name and did some changes in that Power Query code. I can also see that I added a new measure. So this is just a taste of what PBI tools can tell you. It can tell you if you made a change to a visual. Did you set the default to different? I went from 11 to 12 years. This is very powerful. I'm hoping at some point you can actually make this more of a visual aspect where you can see almost like a track changes in a Word document. But today, from a JSON perspective, at least you can understand, if you kind of understand the structure, and I would say it takes you maybe a couple days to figure out the structure in PBI tools. Once you start reading the JSON, it's like reading the matrix code.